we must come together against the BNP. Right? It was everyone, anyone, n'importe qui. Yes, as you know, your sort of Rancerian idiom would have it. Yes, this really was n'importe qui avec n'importe qui. Yes, and that at that point you have an act, a determinate political act of resistance, successful, moreover, which understands itself in terms precisely of unboundedness and a constitutive openness in all sorts of different ways. And that, in the midst of the despair, was a moment of joy, therefore, and is, I think, reasonably well described by the kind of politics that I've been sketching here. So that's a different sort of possible connection. Again, it's not a connection that translates this into that, necessarily. But it does it articulates between this and that. And that's already something, I think.
Okay, thank you. Just as we take more questions, I particularly encourage MPhil students and undergraduates present to feel able to ask questions. It's always incredibly enriching to get questions from different sort of constituencies of the university. So please, if there is something that you want to ask, do feel free to go ahead and ask it. I saw a couple of hands. Well, yeah.
Hi. Maybe this is probably the result of me not actually understanding what you were saying, but I'm going to try anyway. How do you think Finitude could actually provide us with a criteria for what we mean by exploitation? Because it seems to me there's a problem. As soon as you talk about exploitation, you also have to sort of start to talk about dehumanization. And when you talk about dehumanization, you have to talk about what part of being human is being subtracted. So, for example, I'm thinking, for example, of the problem you have in Marx with notions of exploitation being based on a very vague notions of species being, which is not very well defined in Marx and kind of could lead you to a sort of techno-pastoral hell, which no one really wants to go there, really. I mean, it's very strange, fishing in the morning, playing in the afternoon.
In the afternoon, yes.
Yeah, and that's where you begin to realise, if you want to talk about exploitation, are you necessarily forced to actually leave ontology completely, and you're forced to talk about things like biology, and you have to talk about uncomfortable things like the breeding of the species, and what kind of boundary, and how do we find the boundaries in the breeding of the species, and how do we defend the species against powers that the species thinks is in control of, but in fact are controlling the species and its breeding.
Yeah, that's a fantastically good question, Giovanni. And you're absolutely right. So I think I'll try and cover it this way. Finitude allows us to understand the nature of exploitation because the nature of exploitation is the exploitation of finitude. By which I mean that this defines this position. Again, this is a proposition, and it's a description which is therefore can be contested. But this defines exploitation as the exploitation of existence as such, rather than the exploitation of a particular capacity. So there's a difference between selling my labour power and selling my blood, or renting out my circulation system. Yes, there is, as it were, a difference between those two things. But all that does, as you point out, all that does is displace the problem, because it still defines exploitation as the exploitation of existence. It's two things, though. One is that it stops being the exploitation of a particular capacity, which allows you to recognise diverse forms of exploitation that aren't visible, aren't recognisable as such, if you limit exploitation to the exploitation of a particular capacity. So what it actually does, in a sense, is discloses a diversity and a range and an extent of exploitation that otherwise is not visible. Now, however, what that then does, interestingly, is because it's still defined in terms of existence, the question it asks is exactly the question of the limit of the species. Because the question that I willfully included in the first paragraph of this, which was also the abstract I gave Chris, what does it say? Irreducible equality from which no one who lays claim to the name of the human is exempt. Now, what that still does, and that was to flag this up, maintains a tie between the human and existence. So those who exist are humans. So which one? This is no different from Heidegger. That, you know, the animal is poor in world, and the stone is worldless, and so on. So animals live, but humans exist. Animals subsist, but humans exist. And so what interestingly, though, what this definition does open as a question is whether exploitation stops at the limit of the species. And this is where Badiou gets very upset and says, but look, you can't, in that position, you can't make a distinction between humans and animals.
Yeah.
And I say, good. Then let's have a discussion about the exploitation of animal existence, and let's see where we think the boundary is. Yeah? And if you know the Badiou-Rancière position, as we discussed 4 weeks ago, risks reducing to the identification of the exploitable subject as the subject possessed of sufficient mental capacity to declare themselves to be exploited. And I'm not interested in that, so I'm not going there.
Yeah, it's not. It's a bit dangerous, that one.
To say the least.
Yeah.
Yes. But given the history of these definitions, which this is, as we talked about previously, this goes back to Aristotle. Given the history of these definitions, as soon as you dispense with that, which is to say reason, then you find yourself having to include the animals. But that's fine. I think it's absolutely fine. I think let's talk about that.
Could I actually probe that a little bit further? I was interested and potentially slightly worried by the slippages between your use of dehumanisation, subhumanisation, inhumanisation, and then at one point the fully human. And I just want to ask how you distinguish between the de, sub and in, and therefore what the human can become as fully human. Because you obviously had quite a tacit set of valuative scales in different contexts, and very aware that you were drawing on different clusters of contexts in your usage of each one of those at different points in the argument. But that can potentially be a nicer and nicer set of distinctions, like splitting hairs, which may be obfuscatory rather than constructive.
No, I think sort of I was searching for a sentence in which to, you know, see if I could come up with a sentence, Mary, that would make it work. And you could say that dehumanisation is the strategy by which those who seek to define themselves as fully human seek to separate themselves from those they thereby define as subhuman. That cluster, as you very helpfully put it, that cluster of terminology has to do with the, first of all, emerges from Antelme's account of the Nazi camps and Antelme's description of the Nazi project, which is a project of separation, should attempt to separate out the supposedly fully human from the supposedly subhuman, and that you would call that then a campaign of dehumanisation. The point, of course, is that that's a description of the attempt. And it's a critical description of the attempt rather than an affirmation of that as a result. Yes? So Antelme's point is that that can't happen, doesn't happen, can't happen. Show me a subhuman.
Exactly.
He says, yeah. And his point is that you try and show him a subhuman, and he'll say, well, no, that's still a human being. When did that stop being a human being? Which is exactly in that sense, it's the same as what Lévy does with If This Is a Man, and particularly with the poem at the start of If This Is a Man, which presents itself as it's an imperative, it's a demand. It's you who live safe, and so on. Tell me if this is a man. he says. And you don't read that and you think, oh, okay. You think, that's presented as a demand to which you say yes. Yeah, because the implication being, when you get, the woman like a frog, as he puts it, her womb empty and her... No, can't remember, sorry, anyway. But there is similarly woman like a frog. That is there to compel the understanding that the subhuman is a fantasy of the oppressor. And precisely, there is a preceding definition of the subhuman which then supposedly is realised. And these campaigns, ultimately, the point of what they're doing is to say, is to show that supposedly. Yeah. So, in that sense, there is no room at all in the kind of politics that I was sketching out here for a notion such as the fully human or the subhuman. I described the subhumanity at one point as a nonsense, and by the same token, therefore, necessarily, full humanity is a nonsense as well.
So a rehumanisation is actually what it's all about.
Yeah, the dehumanisation never happens. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that happen that proceed on the basis of, or understand themselves as, or can be critically understood as attempted dehumanisation. It happens all the time. It's one of the most standard forms of standard frameworks through which oppression happens, obviously. But the point is to insist that it's always only an attempt. As soon as you accept that it's happened, then you find yourself in very difficult territory indeed. Yeah, exactly as you were suggesting.
We'll have Ian first and then afterwards. Sorry, Ian first and then.
I'm happy to go second if you want.
Sure, let's do it that way.
So, the notion of this attempted dehumanisation, the way that you've posed it in your argument, it seems that there's always a oppressor-oppressed dialectic going on. Do you think that it's ever possible for there to be a self-imposed act of dehumanisation? I'm particularly thinking about one of Kafka's short stories called A Hunger Artist, I think, and in that, it's a very, very sort of scary piece, in that basically he imposes starvation upon himself and reifies or objectifies himself to the point that he becomes subhuman, closer to animal-like. And in that situation, is it more justified to use the word subhuman because there hasn't been an attempt?
That's very, very interesting. The use of Künstler in Kafka's title is particularly interesting, isn't it? Because one way of thinking about that would be to say that if the name of artist if you never get to a point at which the name of artist detaches itself from that spectacle, then you never get to a point at which the name of the human detaches itself from that spectacle either, again, in terms of these, the history about definitions of these times. Another way of putting that would be